On behalf of National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations founding president and CEO, Dr. John Duke Anthony, welcome. Thank you for joining this discussion with leading specialists about future energy trends and their implications. The National Council is a nonprofit, non-governmental, educational organization based in Washington, D.C. It is a 501c3 public charity. Contributions in support of the Council's bridge-building work are welcomed and appreciated. Joining the program today are Dr. Shahab Karan, Philip Cornell, and Colby Connolly. The National Council extends its thanks to these specialists for lending us their views and insights in this discussion. We will shortly turn over the floor to Colby for his moderating today's session. If you are watching the program live, we welcome your questions for the specialists that can be submitted via email to questions@ncusar.org. Again, the email is questions, plural, @ncusar.org. Viewers are encouraged to submit inquiries, and we will do our best to ensure that as many as possible are raised. Again, thank you for joining the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations for this program. We will now welcome Colby Connolly as today's moderator. Colby is a senior research analyst for energy intelligence and a non-resident scholar with the Middle East Institute's program on economics and energy. Colby, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, and thanks to the National Council as well for hosting us for what I'm sure is going to be a really great discussion. More often than not, it can kind of feel as though conversations like this end up really revolving almost entirely around renewable energy when it comes to the future of the Mideast or its approach to the energy transition. And even within that, a lot of the discussion is around solar power. And we'll doubtlessly talk about that and many other things today. But probably a part of the reason for that might be due to the fact that when it comes to energy production in the Mideast and North Africa, we really tend to train a lot of our attention on national oil companies or NOCs. And these are firms that we really don't think about, at least not for a lot of history, as having been at the forefront of developing new renewables capacity. But even now that's really beginning to change. Most of the major NOCs in the region have some kind of renewable energy targets by now, even if they don't have some sort of small capacity. And a lot of the targets that they've adopted are also really conducive to national net zero goals as well, wherever they may have been set. As a good example of that, I doubt it's really coincidental that Saudi Arabia's national net zero target is set for 2060, and its NOC, Saudi Aramco, has a 2050 net zero target. These NOCs are clearly going to be huge parts of the transition for a lot of countries in the region. But there's also been some sort of limited progress. There's been, over the last couple of years, a lot of announcements to the longer term effect, like those around net zero, but also shorter and medium term targets as well. Some of which have translated into progress and some which haven't. So it'll be really interesting to kind of dig down into some of that today as well. And as a result, we'll see a lot of ambition over the next few years, especially with respect to targets that have been set for the end of the decade to make progress in this area. But this is advancing against a backdrop of a region where energy demand is still growing. Oil use is expected to increase in a lot of the region this year. Saudi Arabia, for example, in 2022 broke a couple of different records on the amount of crude it used in the power sector. So there are seemingly some contradictions here that'll be great to get into as well. And we're also having this discussion in the same year that the UAE is hosting COP28, which is certainly a very significant development for how producing countries kind of impact the transition narrative as well. So we're in for certainly some interesting few years ahead. And while I always feel like this phrase gets overused quite a bit, we have a lot of moving parts to look at. So that's a good place for me to stop, I think, and introduce the pair of experts that are joining the discussion today. And I'll start with Dr. Shahab Karan, who is an investor and entrepreneur and a seasoned executive in the semiconductor, power, and clean tech sectors. He founded and ran several private companies and served as an executive or board member at several public companies. In clean tech, he founded and ran Petroleum, where he developed leading edge technologies and launched the largest solar electric project in the world in 2009. He led the development and build out of a major smart city project in Bahrain, solar and smart grid at Saudi Aramco's headquarters, and smart solar projects in Jordan. He currently serves as the president and CEO of Power Edison and executive chairman of EV Edison, two companies he co-founded focused on providing energy storage and electric vehicle or EV charging solutions. Power Edison is the world's largest mobile battery storage system, and EV Edison is building the largest EV supercharging hub located in metropolitan New York. Dr. Karan served as president of Advanced Solutions at Sun Edison and served as president of strategic development at NRG. He serves as an independent director on the boards of NN Inc. and Vital Energy, and he also serves on the advisory boards of the Charles Edison Fund, the Edison Innovation Foundation, and the boards of Enernol and New York Energy Week. He holds a PhD in electrical engineering from the City University of New York and completed his executive management education at Harvard Business School. Also with us today is Mr. Philip Cornell, who is a principal at Economist Impact and the global lead on energy and sustainability. He directs research programs for companies, multilateral finance institutions, foundations, and governments seeking analysis and policy advice. He's also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council of Global Energy Center, where he specializes in energy economics, foreign policy, and global energy markets, and chairs the Clean Energy Ministerial Initiative. Prior to joining the Economist Group, he held several senior advisory and management positions at the World Bank, Saudi Aramco, IEA, and NATO. Held royal research positions at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, the Royal United Services Institute in London, and the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. He's also the author of various public works on international energy security, economics, and governance, and holds master's degrees with distinction in international economics from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and received his bachelor's degree in international relations from Stanford. So certainly a very long list of credentials for our experts today. And with that, Shahab, I think I really want to turn it over to you to get started and kind of perhaps walk us through your initial view of how the transition is sort of progressing around the region, and just sort of generally what kinds of things are on your radar.
Thank you, Kobe. So the area is in the Middle East, looking at a new role, if you wish, in the energy supply globally. And historically, it had tight linkage to customers, especially in the United States, that drove policy, that drove collaboration, and so on. And the facts nowadays is that there isn't that commerce, if you wish, between the supply of energy products that are coming out of the Middle East and the U.S. consumption. And so we see in the Middle East now that the Middle East is tightening relationships with people who need those products, especially in hydrocarbon products today. And while there's still a search vis-a-vis energy transition to what role the Middle East would play, whether through the export of renewable fuels or through the investment of capital, surplus capital. I have some slides. I don't know if this is the right time to share those slides and add some color, or happy to do that after.
Yeah, we can bring them in now if you like, certainly.
I'll be sharing my screen. It's a second screen if I look to the right. Yeah, so and I've shared some of those remarks at a previous event last year that we were at together. And thinking about the energy transition, thinking about energy policies, and specifically as the US and the Arab world are concerned, it really is driven by interests more than permanent friendships or other type of relationships. And it is worth looking into what brought the US and the Arab world closely together, what changes are happening, especially in regard to the energy transition, and what can be seen over the horizon that can reignite a tight relationship, tight collaboration, and friendship. One set of facts that are critical is the fact that the US switched from being a major importer of fuels, hydrocarbon fuels, oil, gas, and so on, from the Middle East to being a major supplier, a major producer. If we look at the screen, and I know Phil gave me more updated data beyond 2020, is that the U.S. is really a net exporter of petroleum products. And the U.S. has not imported practically any practical quantities of Middle East petroleum for almost 10 years now. So absent of that tight linkage and relationship in commerce, how do we look at the new relationships? How do we look at that, especially with the energy transition? The US not only is self-sufficient with petroleum products, petroleum products are primarily used for transportation because of the high energy density associated with them. And the US is not only importing those, its local consumption of liquid fuels is also changing. So the transportation sector, as we know, is being revamped, is being reinvented to become either electrified or using some renewable fuels. This is a chart that just shows by 2030, almost 30% of the new vehicle sales in the US would be electric. Well, that means the demand for liquid fuels will be going away, not in a small incremental fashion, but really as a mega trend. So the US is not importing petroleum from the Middle East, and the US internally is changing the fuel mix, walking away from liquid fuel. So what does that mean for the US-Arab policy and specifically around energy and energy transition? There's another fact to deal with, and that is that we are oceans apart between the Middle East and the US. As we can see from the map, it is more natural, it is more economical for the Middle East products or services to be linked with entities that are either closer or that need them. If we're talking about electric grid, for example, you can envision electric grid between Europe and the Middle East being practical, but an electrical grid, say, between the US and the Arab world is really not that practical. So the fact that we're oceans apart causes us to pause and think what elements, what pillars can be put in place to underpin new policies, and especially for the energy transition. There are a lot of areas that come to mind, but frankly, it is really hard to think about something similar to what we had with liquid fuels or with petroleum. Obviously, collaboration at the global level when it comes to greenhouse gas targets, like you mentioned, the UAE is hosting international events around climate change and global warming. You have examples where collaboration can happen at the capital and financial level. We've seen the UAE commit to about $100 billion to be invested in the energy transition section or sector in the United States, as referred to as SPACE, the partnership is referred to as SPACE. So capital can transcend oceans. Policy can transcend oceans. But what else can be put in place into action that is really practical, that can be underpinned by true set of economics that are sustainable for many years to come? Technology comes into play or comes to mind, as the US has a number of advanced technologies when it comes to the new energies or the energy forms that are required for the energy transition, clean technologies, or if we think about, I have on the screen some of the renewable fuels. I think the renewable fuels between, as an export-import between the US and Middle East is going to be hard. And I'll show a slide that supports that fact. However, when it comes to equipment and technologies, I think that's an area that's ripe for collaboration. Challenge is the dollar value or the scale of that intercommerce is not going to be anywhere near what we used to have in terms of petroleum exports and intercommerce. This is a little bit busy slide, but it does show some data that the reason, let me see if I can, if there's a way to use a mouse here or pointer. Can you see the pointer?
Yes, I can see that.
Okay. So primarily, why was petroleum a successful product for trade? It's due to the fact that if you look at diesel or gasoline or petroleum in this area, it's the fact that it does pack high volumetric energy and energy density. So by volume or by energy content, you get a lot per cubic feet or per barrel. And so you are able to pack a lot of energy in a tanker and ship it from the Middle East and bring it to the US. And that is the same reason petroleum was used for transportation, because you're able to put a lot of energy in a small volume, use it for transport. If we look at the new technologies or new renewable fuels, or look at, you'll see that they're far less as an energy carrier than liquid fuels. If you go all the way down today to, for example, the most advanced form of technology in batteries is lithium-ion batteries. You can see it's very small when it comes to these densities, either by volume or by energy, compared to liquid fuels. So even if you thought, let me pack electrons, for example, in batteries in the Middle East and bring them to the US, it's not a practical aspect. So this is just a chart to show how many of the new solutions don't support transport of that energy over long distances. Now, having said that, we see that, let me see, there's another slide I might, for this one. So having said that, we know that the US is electrifying transportation. And electrifying transportation, that means a lot of batteries that are going into vehicles. And frankly, the US is electrifying things beyond transportation as well. We see, for example, in New York City, there's something called Local Law 97 that aspires to turn New York City into a zero carbon city by electrifying heating, electrifying cooking, electrifying anything where hydrocarbon products were burned before. So electrifying things means more electricity, more batteries to be sustainable when renewable energy is not being produced. And we can see a number of market leaders in battery supply that are just experiencing massive growth in production. I mean, compared over a few years from 2021 and looking at 25, orders of magnitude higher than previous capacity. So massive explosion of production. The US IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, has a number of incentives for local manufacturing. So the US today is looking for massive supply of raw materials, technologies, establishing a battery industry that would enable the energy transition. I dug a little bit deeper into what can be done between, for example, just this is an example in the battery space, because I operated in battery space and we look at it all the way from upstream to downstream. And we notice that type of chemistry for lithium ion called LFP, which has lithium iron phosphate, is becoming more and more the dominant chemistry for lithium ion batteries. And so you need lithium, you need iron, you need phosphate. And if you look at the Middle East, I gathered some of this data. We noticed that on the phosphate side, if you look at the top 10 phosphate producers in the world, you'll notice that 5 out of the 10 happen to be in the Middle East and North Africa as Arab countries. You see Morocco, you see Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Tunisia. When you also look at lithium reserves around the globe, which is, it's kind of the new gold or the new petroleum, you'll see that in terms of reserves, Chile is the leading country in the world. Australia comes as a second. But a very interesting fact is that the Dead Sea in the Middle East holds almost 5.4 million metric tons of lithium. And it's such a high density, it's almost 300,000, higher 300,000 ppm or high, meaning 10 times saltier than the oceans and the seas, and has a lot of lithium. So it can come as a major, like, second reserve around the globe, the lithium that is really needed to fuel the energy transition in regard to batteries. Saudi Arabia has major mineral deposits in what's called the Arabian Shield due to geological formations. So this is just a glimpse of, with the energy transition, looking at the new technologies, looking at the new minerals, looking at the new elements that are needed to enable the energy transition. We see that the Arab world can have a role. You need to develop new technologies, new businesses, but nonetheless, there are roles. It is not the traditional petroleum export, but it is the new technologies, especially around batteries. And I'm confident that there are other areas that would be similar to batteries. Well, this concludes my slides, and looking forward to any comments and questions throughout it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I think, before we get into too many questions, Phil, maybe I can kick it to you at this point for your views on some of this outlook as well, and some of what you'd see as probably, I'd say, the most pressing energy issues in U.S. Mideast relations, which probably have a few individual carve-outs. But how would you categorize some of those and sort of place them in the order of importance?
Sure. Well, thanks very much, Colby, and thanks to the Council for hosting this discussion. I think what we really took away from Shihab's slides and the presentation is, what a potential this region holds to be a major supplier of the kind of minerals that we're going to need for the energy transition, and also, I would say, for the technologies that are going to be required. I mean, when it comes to things like solar production, the region, and particularly the Gulf region, has some really of the lowest production costs and connection costs for solar energy today. And so the potential is clearly there. I would say what it's really linked to, though, from the short term to the long term transition question, is the relationship with oil and revenues to the region in the near term. And I think we have to think of the region always as two very different blocks. There are the major oil producers focused in places like the Gulf, which have certainly seen a major windfall in revenue over the past year and a half as a result of emerging from COVID and also the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has caused significant volatility in the market, but caused the most profitable year for companies like Saudi Aramco, and led to a serious confidence in the region in terms of its energy future. But on the other side, there's also the block of Arab countries who are massive importers of fossil fuels and have seen the volatility and high costs over the past year and a half, 2 years, as a major detriment to their balance sheets and an energy security concern. And for there, I'm thinking about countries like Morocco, which imports something like 90% of its energy needs or of its fossil fuel needs. Also countries like Egypt, which is a big importer of fossil fuel products around things like fertilizers, and also countries, that are facing weak energy security situations, particularly places like Lebanon, the Palestinian territories, and Iraq. So I think that we need to consider what are these different situations, and what does energy transition mean? How does it look different for these two different groups of countries? For countries like Saudi Arabia, the energy transition has been, I would say, rocky in terms of the deployment of renewable energy vis-a-vis very ambitious plans. So since the beginning of the last decade, but especially since 2016 and the implementation or the release of their national transformation plan and Saudi Vision 2030, we've seen very ambitious targets to deploy renewable energy. And for example, under that 2023 target, so this year, we're something on the order of 22 gigawatts of renewable energy that were expected to be deployed. To give you an idea of the gap with reality, about a tenth of that is actually operating at the moment. And that's on top of even bigger ambitions that have been sort of announced and then quietly gone by the wayside. I would put at the top of that list the 2018 announcement by the Saudis with SoftBank to deploy 200 gigawatts. So again, think about that's another order of magnitude higher than even so 220 and 200 as an ambitious goal. So I think there are real questions about why we're seeing these sort of difficulties in deployment on the ground, and what's the purpose. For a country like Saudi Arabia or the UAE, deploying renewable energy and engaging in the energy transition serves two principal goals. One is freeing up oil for export, particularly at a moment when oil prices are so high and are expected to stay high for the medium term. This is what I would call, and what's been discussed as, the feast before the famine for oil producers, meaning that over the long term, we're likely to see eventually a peak in oil demand. It's probably something like a decade away. But as the energy transition continues, in the long term, there's going to be a reduced capacity and price of oil. Now, the Middle East producers will be the last man standing with the cheapest and the cleanest oil production on the market, but they know that they need to capitalize on a strong market while it's there. So producing renewable energy can free up oil, which is otherwise used domestically. In the Saudi case, that's something like 3.4 million barrels per day of internal consumption, and about 1 million barrels of which is just for oil generated power generation. So some of the least efficient power generation, and something that the Saudi government is trying to wean the country off of. So in terms of just its internal consumption, despite energy efficiency efforts, despite deploying renewable energy, the current domestic consumption of oil and fossil fuels in the region is simply something that's unsustainable. So those efforts to engage in transition are directly related to the bottom line and meeting sort of budget requirements for oil revenue in the short to medium term. For a country like Morocco, on the other hand, engaging in the energy transition is sort of an existential one about energy security. So this is a country, again, which imports large amounts of oil and petroleum products, some of which, for example, have been coming from Russia. There's been a complicated energy security situation in the last few years, and particularly since the Russian invasion. So Morocco has continued to import Russian diesel, of course, under the price cap. And let's remember that one of the reasons why, and we can get into that in a moment, but one of the reasons in the short term why we're seeing OPEC production cuts is a question about demand, and that has to do with the efficacy of the Russian price cap on global markets in terms of keeping Russian oil flowing, and so supply staying at a pretty high level while demand falls off. But again, in the Moroccan case, both for oil and also for gas in particular, which is subject to rocky relations with the Algerians, a sort of pieced together deal of importing LNG via Spain. Their energy security right now is something that's of grave concern. So as they ramp up their energy transition on things like wind, where there's some very high capacity, engaging also in more solar outlays, and of course, trying to maintain their hydro capacity even during a time of drought, that is a much more it comes from a different place in terms of what the drivers of that are. So I just want to sort of put that in context. To go back to kind of OPEC politics and what's happened just this year and bring in sort of the US, what is, I think, really striking are the couple of OPEC production cuts that we've seen last month, but also back in October. And so they caused, I would say, a lot of discord between Washington and what it had considered some of its closest Arab allies, particularly in the face of efforts by Washington to up oil production in the face of Russian sanctions and trying to curtail Russian energy revenues. Again, this was before sort of the price cap had been introduced, and the fear was that a lot of Russian production would be locked in. And so this, I think, again, caused a lot of consternation in Washington and sort of exposed a shift in the relationship between Washington and key allies in the region that had been going on at least since the middle of the decade, and one that I think had caught some people in Washington a little bit off guard, the degree to which Saudi Arabia and parts of the Gulf had developed, and the outlook had shifted during COVID and the Trump administration to a degree where a lot of people, let's say within GCC administrations, and particularly in Riyadh, think of the U.S. continuing to act as friends, but not necessarily as allies. And I think that goes to the first slide that Shihab put up there about relations between the states being based in interests rather than in sort of, long-term emotional relationships. But again, it's one that certainly caught the U.S. off guard and sort of signaled a new Saudi geopolitical strategy to triangulate between some of the major powers, partly for energy reasons. Again, in an environment of high oil revenues and a great deal of confidence, but also in terms of how it looks at its future development within the context of the energy transition. So that means looking to Asian partners, in particular China, also looking to Russia, its OPEC plus partners, and also to other partners, from Israel to India to the Japanese for technology support around those parts of the economy where it really sees a growth future. So I think for them, maintaining sort of current oil balances and diplomacy is important, again, in that short to medium term where they can benefit from the revenues in order to drive forward their economic transformation plans, but also thinking about what kind of partnerships are delivering the technology support and the cooperation and the investment to be able to forward their energy transition and sort of wider digitalization and new economy goals. So I think that what we're, as we move forward to the OPEC cut that happened also this year, there is a geopolitical aspect, certainly, but I think that there's also a genuine debate to be had, and a legitimate debate about what the demand for energy is going to look like in the global economy over the next year. There's a huge amount of uncertainty on the horizon around particularly two of the major markets, the US and China. We heard from the IMF this week during its spring meetings that the likelihood of a hard economic landing in the US has boosted significantly. There continues to be inflation and therefore aggressive monetary policy, which is likely to cause a potential slowdown. And so we're going to have to see how that develops and how that sort of reckoning within the US economy and recession happens over the next quarter. And in China, we've seen an emergence from COVID and a COVID closure, which masked a lot of structural weaknesses that were already ongoing inside the Chinese economy and causing significant slowdown, which was revealed in its official forecast for growth in 2023 at something like 5%, which is extremely low, not just in the context of previous Chinese growth numbers over the past decade, but particularly in an opening year. So coming out of COVID and a return to sort of open economic activity throughout the country, which should have seen growth significantly higher than what had been sort of the standard growth trajectory in pre-COVID times. And we're not seeing that. So between those two things, I think that there is a legitimate concern about what demand is going to look like. That being said, the cuts, the most recent cuts by OPEC were certainly caught a lot of people off guard, partly because it's not yet clear what those kind of economic impacts are going to be. So it seems for some people that it was kind of premature in terms of understanding what the economy is going to look like, but also because of the internal politics that are happening within OPEC. So we need to remember that there's OPEC Plus, which includes the Russians and some other partners, but the main players within OPEC are those which are the producers with the main spare capacity. And we're really thinking about Kuwait, the UAE, and especially Saudi Arabia. I would say that what's driving, let's say, that relationship is particularly what's happening between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. I think within Abu Dhabi, there's, I would say, more of a economic rationale. There's less desire to rock the geopolitical boat, particularly as it looks forward to hosting COP28 later in the year and continuing to show itself as a global partner for the energy transition and for energy security and stability. But at the end, it seems like the Saudis won out. So there is some underlying tension. I would say that some of the questions about a rift, or even there was a Wall Street Journal article earlier in the year that discussed the possibility of UAE exiting from OPEC, are probably not going to happen in the short term. But you can see that there's still a diverging opinions among OPEC partners about what the future of policy is going to be, and also about how that impacts their relationships with both the U.S. and the other major powers. And I'm thinking again about China and Russia. So I guess I think that outlook in the short term around the oil economy and how it's linked then to energy transition is really a key that I think is going to be driving some of these debates and some of the progress that we see around the transition and new technology. So I'm going to leave it there so that we can move on to questions. But anyway, I think thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. We are starting to get a couple of audience questions coming in. The first one, maybe is kind of dovetails well with the oil market discussion. But the first question that came in is, how many years in the future do you predict the decline of U.S. and global reliance on natural gas? Obviously, not an extraordinary amount of Mideast natural gas being imported into the U.S., but I guess in terms of the U.S.'s ability to kind of sustain itself as an exporter along with some of these other larger countries in the region, what some of that bleeds in. So I don't know, either of you want to take a stab at that one? We've got a couple more as well, and some of my own we can get into. So it's whichever way you'd like to handle it.
I think so. We have to kind of think about what the different fuels are used for. So we said petroleum is primarily used for transportation. However, natural gas is primarily used for generating electricity. And it is, for example, in the US, competing with coal. So we see coal plants getting retired while gas plants getting built up. Gas does help in what we call firming up the grid when renewable energy is not there. But we know renewable energy remains a very small percentage of electricity generation on the grid in the US and frankly throughout the world. So I personally expect natural gas I have many more years of life, at least 30, 40 more years, or at least 2050, maybe 2060, where we still have a very strong reliance in the US and globally on natural gas, simply because it is a complement to renewables. It does have a lower carbon footprint compared to coal. And we know places like China, India, many other places in the world, they're even still building coal plants, and so there is a role for natural gas to retire those and switch them to a cleaner fuel. So natural gas, in my opinion, will still have many years as a viable supply of energy.
Yeah, and I would agree with that assessment. I think we could talk about natural gas markets sort of globally, which has been severely impacted by the Russian invasion. Natural gas, which is a much less fungible product than oil, has seen a much higher shortfall because of its reduced exports to Europe, which are mostly by pipe. And so that caused, a major spike in natural gas prices and LNG prices last year. Those have come down significantly in Europe, but still remain several times higher than the 5-year average. In the US, again, shale gas production have seen prices come down significantly, well below actually pre-invasion levels. So natural gas at the moment continues to be a relatively important product for keeping the lights on and also for industrial uses and development. There are major efforts, obviously, by policymakers, and I'm thinking especially by multilateral development banks, to curtail financing for natural gas projects in other parts of the world. I think that potentially causes a rift for developing countries where natural gas is a key part of their development strategies. And so always when we think about the energy transition, the risk of demonizing one fuel or another can look very different depending on where you're standing and where you are at your point of development. And I think we need to be mindful of that as we look to keep support for the energy transition broadly in place, particularly in places like the emerging markets and developing world that are going to be such a big part of the issue. Now, in the Middle East, as Colby mentioned, natural gas exports are relatively limited, and I'm thinking particularly in the Gulf countries. Their expansion of natural gas projects have been used specifically to meet domestic demand, and again, lower that reliance on oil-fired generation in order to free up more oil for export. But there has been very limited LNG capacity that has been that's come online, for example, in the Arabian Peninsula. Instead, some of that surplus gas is being used to forward hydrogen strategies. So I'm thinking particularly about blue hydrogen, which is gas-generated hydrogen plus CCS, of which the Saudis have begun exports only a year or two ago. So there is a role there for domestically developed gas to supply external markets, but not directly as LNG. Again, in those other parts of the Arab world that I had mentioned, natural gas remains a really important part of the strategy. In Egypt, offshore production, and in the East Mediterranean, offshore production of natural gas is a key element of revenue and development for not just Egypt, now in places like Lebanon, now that maritime territorial disputes have been settled largely with American diplomatic support. So it plays a key role in that part of the region. And also, I mentioned Morocco earlier, facing this natural gas crunch because of relationships with Algeria, and looking for new routes to bring natural gas into the European market now that it's obviously facing a structural shortfall following the Russian invasion, including, for example, the Nigeria-Morocco pipeline, a huge and ambitious project to bring Gulf of Guinea gas and West African gas to the European market via North Africa. So it's playing a very important role in global markets going forward, but a varied role in Arab energy economies, depending on which side of the, whether we're on the east side or the west side, let's say.
Right. Well, we also have a hydrogen question that came in, which I figured probably wouldn't take long. Whenever we're talking about the transition in relation to the Mideast, hydrogen never takes too long to come up. But the way the question is asked, I felt was important, and I kind of have a bit of my own part that I would add to it too. But the question is, what sort of timeline is there before hydrogen can be an energy source that contributes meaningfully to global production and consumption? And specifically with relation to the Mideast too, I mean, something that I tend to think about is, everyone's got a ton of projects they've announced. Obviously, some of them will eventually materialize and some of them won't. But there are some pretty big expectations about the development of the hydrogen market that I think underpin a lot of this capacity. So I'd be curious to hear both of your views on what kind of risks some of these countries may be taking that are going in very heavily on hydrogen now, that don't necessarily know in great detail how the market is going to develop in the future. Phil, I mean, you were just talking about this, so maybe we can come back to you, and then Shahab, we can go back over to you again.
Sure. Well, look, hydrogen is certainly very hyped recently. And if you look at plans, particularly from countries like Germany or Japan, hydrogen plays a very key role in their energy transition strategies. I think we have to be careful when we talk about what the market for hydrogen is realistically going to be. For the moment, there's an established hydrogen market. It's been around for something like 50 years. Usually it's been produced with fossil fuels. But as we think about expanding those applications, it serves basically two major roles. I think the most obvious role is decarbonizing otherwise hard to abate industries, places like green steel or green cement, heavily emitting industries where hydrogen can play a key role, and particularly green hydrogen or hydrogen that's developed with renewable energy can play a key role in decarbonizing those industries at a relatively high cost. So the cost of something like green hydrogen is still, depending on where it's produced, something like $4 to $10 or more in terms of cost. One thing that the US policy in the IRA has done is offer an extremely generous subsidy or tax incentive of about $3 per kilogram of green hydrogen. So it brings, if you're on the lower end of that scale, a $4 kilogram of green hydrogen down to $1, which is suddenly cheaper, actually, than even fossil fuel produced hydrogen otherwise, and makes it a competitive and a viable option. And as a result, I think we're going to see an expansion of demand for things like electrolyzers, which are the key technology to convert that renewable energy into hydrogen. And that sort of economies of scale hopefully are going to start bringing down those costs of green hydrogen to a point where they become competitive. Even so, the second major application, which is to export renewable energy from places that are far-flung from markets, and I'm thinking about places like Oman, which I'll talk about in just a minute, that potential to use renewable energy, create hydrogen, ship it to somewhere like Japan, and then put it back into electricity is an extremely inefficient supply chain. So I'm thinking back to Shahab's graph about, what are sort of the energy potential. That is a supply chain with a huge amounts of losses, and it's quite inefficient and massive cost implications along the chain. However, again, if we look towards 2030, 2032, it could be a viable option in some applications. And if we can create a market, and I would say there are some key programs that are out there in alliances, such as something like the First Movers Coalition, which has been championed by John Kerry and the US government alongside partners like the World Economic Forum. And those kind of programs to actually create and generate demand in those key markets like hard to abate sectors could start to create potential where the supply is therefore meaningful. And some countries in the Middle East are really banking on this. And I mentioned Oman. So recently, as recently as February, March, Oman closed historic auctions for hydrogen production areas that were very well subscribed, and various consortium of international companies from Shell to Continental, Indian companies. I mean, a really diverse set of investors have committed something like $60 billion to green hydrogen development in Oman, and given extremely favorable renewable energy potential alongside its relatively remote geographical position from major markets, makes it the kind of place where this could be a viable part of the economy and in the transition. But again, I think we need to be realistic. Hydrogen is certainly no silver bullet to replace fossil fuels or to engage the energy transition. Rather, it's going to play an important but probably pretty niche role in the global energy economy even after 2030.
Great. Yeah,
So,
Shihab, over to you. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with everything Phil said, and I would add hydrogen was also thought about as a fuel for mobility, for vehicles, and as a substitute to petroleum products. So there was a race between batteries and hydrogen, and I know if you track, Elon Musk had kind of made a statement early on about hydrogen versus batteries, but I think you see that Elon is right, at least for the what we call light and medium duty vehicles. Heavy duty vehicles, there's still a debate whether hydrogen is the right fuel or batteries. Think about the Tesla semis. And then if you go to aviation and you go to the global shipping, tankers, ships, and so on, is it a battery or is it hydrogen? When we say hydrogen, you'll see, and I put the chart up on the screen, there's hydrogen in its pure form, which lacks the volumetric density. So you need much, much larger volume to transport the same amount of energy compared to other fuels. But there are other what we call hydrogen carriers. So methanol, ammonia have hydrogen in them, and we call them hydrogen carriers. And you see, for example, Masdar Aqua Power out of the Middle East saying, okay, and I think there are projects that I read got announced, for example, along like near the Suez Canal or in Saudi Arabia by the Red Sea, to produce such either green methanol or liquid ammonia to be used for as fuel for tankers, because ships do come from the east to the west, passing through the Middle East. Another application for hydrogen that's contemplated around the world, but primarily in Europe and the US, is as an energy storage to go hand in hand with renewable energy, which happen to be intermittent. So how do you store energy overnight that's clean? Obviously, batteries are one form, but hydrogen happens to be another competing form. Batteries are, made much more progress. So at a high level, I agree with Phil that hydrogen today is a little bit overhyped. It does have some major technological issues to be resolved. You cannot just simply put it in a pipeline. It does permeate through steel. It is energy content compared to natural gas or other fuels. The volume, I think safety, I'm seeing more reports recently that it can be made safe. There is the off-gassing that can cause major loss, like a battery can sit for almost a year and not lose much of its state of charge. But if you have a tank with hydrogen, you have to be kept really, really cold, which means it takes a lot of parasitic energy to store it, compared to just a battery that sits on a shelf somewhere. So storing energy in the form of hydrogen, I've seen estimates where you lose as high as 1% of that energy a day just to keep that low temperature. So it is not ideal yet for long-term storage. And the battle is on. You see companies in the US, for example, I think Nikola has trucks that are based on hydrogen or batteries. That debate is not settled yet. Elon Musk said, no, it is settled. It would be batteries. So hydrogen is still looking for its applications. We see even today some electric planes while everyone thought that's impossible and it's going to be only possible with hydrogen, but we see some electric planes. So if hydrogen doesn't find its footing soon, I think the train would have left the station on hydrogen.
Well, thank you, because that's particularly interesting, and it actually something I'd kind of like to follow up with a question of my own for either of you, which is that it seems, and you may have kind of answered this already, but it seems like a lot of the strategies and projects that we've seen pop up around the region so far, particularly in the Gulf, but Shihab, you mentioned Egypt as well, are kind of geared towards exports, and we don't really see much in the way of interest in domestic use for a lot of this hydrogen. What do you think will eventually change that? Or is it just that this is something that is being looked at as a way of kind of making up for, potentially smaller oil exports in the future for now? It's kind of an off the cuff question, so either of you can take that how you want, but it is something that as we continue to observe, this is something that definitely stands out. So certainly interested in your thoughts there.
We've done the techno-economic analyses on what we call firm power, effectively, and I'll speak to the power sector. Phil can speak to others if you wish, but most of the applications that we're seeing today in the U.S., aside from industry, I'm more involved in the power sector, is that hydrogen as a complement to renewable energy, to firm up that energy so you can have it reliably 24/7. But when you look at the techno-economic analyses, that you'll find today that renewable energy, wind or solar, coupled with energy storage in the form of chemistry, like lithium ion, for example, does beat the economics of using hydrogen for storage. And frankly, there are clever ways of using what's called long-term storage, even using chemistry. And so I really don't see hydrogen as, especially like let's say in the economies in the Middle East. Phil mentioned Morocco. To me, a country like Morocco has fantastic wind and solar resources. They will need a lot of capital because wind or solar, you pay for the equipment up front. There's no fuel cost. And so kind of to get the levelized cost of energy, it's a major upfront investment, but the unit economics are in place and the payback is in place. So you'll find international investors who are willing to come in and fund that upfront investment. So batteries, in my opinion, have already won in many of the applications where hydrogen was meant to be. Transportation is one, firming renewables is another, and so again, the areas where that hydrogen can have a viable play. I think the international shipping, marine shipping, is a very interesting one, and I think the Middle East is doing the right thing, being a hub or a pathway for international ships. I don't know if they have the time to stop and refuel, but that's a very interesting and practical application.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just, I agree with that. I think the domestic market for hydrogen, if that's what you're asking about, Colby, is going to be very limited in that region just because alternatives, both clean and fossil, are so abundant and relatively affordable. But so what the focus is on export. I think Shihab brought up some really interesting points about the fundamental and underlying competition between direct delivery of clean electricity from renewable sources and electricity in direct use of electricity in applications rather than hydrogen. I think that perhaps not competition, but that cost differential and what those markets look like in various applications going forward is going to be really important. And in terms of transporting renewable energy, let's say competition or direct electricity alternative is expanding high voltage DC, HVDC long distance transmission, both between countries, between continents, undersea cables, these kinds of power grid integration that is going to have to develop in order to access those kind of remote areas where renewable energy is particularly viable. And to bring back the Moroccan example, where a lot of that extremely good wind potential exists, is in the far south of the country. And so building up HVDC infrastructure within Morocco to bring it to the north and eventually to Europe is a much more efficient way to get clean energy into the European market than exporting it, for example, in the form of hydrogen. That being said, as these markets develop and as demand increases in places exactly, perhaps like shipping, perhaps like the development of green steel, green cement, and other industrial purposes, it does position the Middle East extremely well to serve as a hub for production and export of that resource. So it's a market that's still developing. It's still relatively small, and the key is going to for demand is going to be what is again the cost differential between that and directly delivered electricity, and where are those places where electricity is just not a feasible option. Shihab mentioned aviation. Electric airplanes are great for very small seaters. We're never going to see clean energy jumbo jets until we start to, until, at least 10, 15, 20 years out, where hydrogen might be part of the solution. So there are those applications, again, that are often decades away, that might come closer with concerted policy. And clearly there's a lot of effort to do that, but we have to be realistic. And I think that difference in how realistic the role hydrogen will play, the difference in opinion, is as evident as in debates over the G20 communiques, which show a country like Japan putting it very much at the center of the discussion, and other G20 partners, European and North American partners, watering down that language and trying to curb expectations about how big this market will really be in especially the short and medium term.
So going to another one of these audience questions here that I think links well with the hydrogen topic, but is really kind of builds it out a bit into the political economy of the issue. It reads, the GCC countries, particularly KSA, UAE, and Oman, seem to be moving aggressively into exporting clean energy as green hydrogen. Can their economies and governments handle this transition, and do they expect the profit margins for clean energy exports to be on par with petroleum? Example, high enough to sustain the cost of welfare states with break-even costs for oil well above $50 a barrel today. So I think the idea there is really the question of to what extent are hydrogen exports replacing oil exports, which is a fairly easy question. But maybe some of the more granular aspects of how that kind of a shift in the revenue issue might impact not only kind of the social contract, but actually the ability to kind of fund the transition efforts. Either you can start wherever you'd like with that one. I think there's a range of ways to address that. So I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, so no, I don't think the export of hydrogen will ever catch up to historic levels of petroleum exports. And we have to think about, why is hydrogen being in demand in economies like in Europe or the US? It is in demand because of the energy transition. It's to decarbonize fuel. So when the world had only one means of creating energy through fossil fuels, you needed the supply of fossil fuels, which existed in some geographical areas around the world. Today, to generate hydrogen, Morocco, with its solar and wind resources, can be a major exporter of hydrogen. Same with Spain. Same with many other countries. Jordan can be, and so that geographical kind of mineral concentration is not true anymore, and thus that monopoly or that differentiation or unfair advantage of having hydrocarbon in the ground inside your borders is not true anymore, because any country, I'm not saying Northern European, but even in Northern Europe, you can use hydropower, you can use wind power, you can use wave energy, produce hydrogen. So the competition for hydrogen production is far greater than the competition 20, 30 years ago, or 50 years ago for exporting petroleum, which required that you would have those deposits. So that's a fundamental difference in terms of dominating a hydrogen export market, or being, the kind of the lead entity or country in that regard. So I don't ever expect hydrogen exports to be anywhere near the levels that we saw historically when it came to petroleum exports.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that, especially in the major oil exporting countries in the GCC. There's just the market is not as big. The profit margins are slimmer, at least for in the immediate term. And I don't think those countries, and particularly Saudi Arabia, are looking to move away from oil anytime soon. I mean, as I mentioned, they're expanding their oil production capacity. It's going to be expanded by something like 1 million barrels per day within a couple of years. There's massive investments that are going in to expand production capacity for oil. They see it as a major part of the energy economy going forward. And as headwinds to investment in oil projects in OECD and Western countries increase, both because of cost issues, higher, more expensive money, and in places like the US and shale oil, difficulty to attract capital given the riskiness of those investments and investors being burned over the last couple of years, as well as ESG and other environmental restrictions on oil production and oil planning. It means that the Gulf region is going to, and OPEC is going to take up a bigger and bigger part of a potentially shrinking pie, but not for another maybe 10 years. But they're going to be holding a much larger part of the market. And I don't think that they have any qualms, they're pretty upfront about their expectations that oil will continue to play a key role. That being said, again, over the long term, the writing is on the wall for oil, in the sense that it's going to start to potentially decline in demand. It already has been declining pretty seriously in the OECD countries, in Europe and in the US. All of the demand growth is coming out of Asia. So it's going to have to depend on what are the policies in place in Asia. We talked about slowing Chinese growth, but there's going to be booming Indian growth over the next 10 to 15 years. So that's really going to decide the future of oil. Oil isn't going to be dead tomorrow by any means, and hydrogen certainly isn't going to take its place.
No, certainly. And I think the fact that NOCs are really the ones leading upstream investment in the last year or so are pretty good evidence of where the sentiment is on that. Okay, so maybe we can move away from the hydrogen talk a bit. A couple other questions that came through that I thought were interesting here. A question about the role of energy with regard to water supply in the Mideast and North Africa. It says there's lots of water needed for production from some of these newer energy sources. What about energy for desalination? That's an interesting one, because it seemed like for a little while there was a bit more talk of renewable desalination. It feels like we hear less of it now, but I don't know. Maybe that's just because I'm not paying close enough attention. So Shahab, maybe that's a good place for you to start there.
Sure. I think, and Phil alluded to this earlier, that the local consumption of energy in even oil-producing countries had gotten to a point where sometimes it's not sustainable. And so water production is one, agriculture, industrial uses, and so on. We know the most dominant technology today for desalination is using a mechanical method in the form of reverse osmosis, as compared to the MSF thermal process, which is much more energy intensive. But the driver for RO, reverse osmosis, is electricity for these high pressure pumps. And like Phil mentioned earlier, we see that in the Middle East, in general, that electricity production through solar energy is very attractive, very competitive. So I think that's a sector that holds great promise in terms of being electrified through renewable energy, and for making it more sustainable, and frankly potentially expanding the production at a lower cost, because burning liquid fuels for electricity generation is kind of the last application you want to go to. It is not the right one economically, environmentally, and otherwise. So electricity, water production with renewables is a real application. It's a viable one, and it's a great opportunity in the Middle East.
Yeah, I would piggyback on that. I think the technologies to engage in desalination and power desalination have been developing rapidly. So there are some major projects in the Middle East. I'm thinking particularly the French company Veolia working at NEOM to engage in a massive reverse osmosis plant powered by solar power, which I think is slated to come online something like 2025. I think is going to be a good demonstration of that technology, which hadn't been the case a few years ago, because let's remember that renewable energy, and especially solar power, is in principle, and has been for a long time, a massive user of water, not just in the production of solar panels, but then also in their operation. Again, technologies have been coming on board for solar power in the Middle East that are dust resistant, low water. Again, I think Shihab would know a little bit more about this. You mentioned Shihab's role in providing solar power at the Saudi Aramco headquarters, which is a place where I also worked. And I remember in some of those early trials, there was a real question about what the final balance is between energy which is used to desalinate the water, which then cleans the panels, which then generate energy, and what is the final net benefit, and does it sort of balance out? I think we're going beyond that at this point. But the other technologies which have been touted as particularly good in the desalination area are things like nuclear. And so as we look forward to not just the expansion of light water reactors and large nuclear projects in places like the UAE, but also the potential for small modular reactors, again, several years away still, but something like desalination is one of those great potential applications for small modular reactors. So there are a few options, but this, again, the technology deployments and demonstrations that we're seeing right now for renewable generated reverse osmosis are extremely promising, and that concern about the balance for the energy production that we were feeling maybe 7 years ago, I think is less and less of the case.
All right. Well, thanks for the comment on the small modular reactors too, because that answers another one of the questions that we had come up, which is a particularly interesting one. We're sort of getting into the last stretch of our time here. But what we've seen kind of in common with a lot of the the initiatives and the projects that we're talking about is that particularly in the Gulf, but in some other places as well, a lot of regional governments are kind of marshaling this ever greater number of state resources to tackle the transition. And a question that I wanted to pose to both of you guys is something we've probably heard before in a much broader way, but what are the risks, if any, that where these kinds of national champions, so to speak, are getting involved, whether that's, an Aqua Power or a Masdar, a sovereign wealth fund directly or indirectly, or even an NOC? I mean, what's the risk that they're kind of crowding out this space to an extent that either, not just local private sector firms, but foreign investors that a lot of these countries have been looking to attract, start to encounter difficulty operating in that kind of a space? I mean, maybe that's something we could get some comment on here, because it comes up a lot as a potential challenge, but it feels like the discussion tends to stop there. So maybe that's something we could mull over for a bit as well.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Shihab, please go first.
Yeah, please.
I think that is an issue. I mean, you mentioned Aqua Power as a national champion. Let's remember that Aqua Power was an independent company at the forefront of this technology, continues to produce literally some of the lowest cost renewable energy, and provide some of the lowest cost bids in projects, not only in Saudi Arabia, but also across the Middle East and North Africa. And it was only since it was 40% stake was acquired by the Saudi Public Investment Fund, the PIF, has it become a quote unquote national champion. And this strategy is something we've seen a lot across a lot of different companies in the region. I'm thinking also about things like Kareem and others, where successful private sector companies have then been gobbled up. The question is, do they then remain as competitive do they remain so competitive that they then crowd out competition within the region? I think that's something that's worth posing. But overall, if we look at how petrodollars and oil revenue is being used and recycled through the system, that has also changed significantly in the region. So if you go back something like 10 to 15 years, the classic model was taking those petrodollars, putting them in Western and particularly American financial institutions and investing in relatively low risk ventures. Now we're seeing a more aggressive and more higher risk appetite in terms of that, of where that money is going. So a much higher percentage going into equities and also into infrastructure investments and into companies like these that are investing in new technologies. So that public money will continue to flow. I think the strategy that's in place is not to flow only to those quote unquote national champions, but actually to seed a whole ecosystem of advanced energy companies within the region in order to grow that wider ecosystem, as opposed to just funneling it into one national champion. So whether those investments pan out at the end, I think the goal anyway is to create a sustainable and viable wider ecosystem of technology in order to breed that competition and advance the wider economy. And that's, at the heart of some of these economic transformation ambitions.
Yeah, so in regard to that question, I actually spoke with Mohammed Al-Ramahi, the CEO of Masdar, and Mohammed Ibn Ayyan, the chairman and founder of Aqua, in preparation of my remarks at our previous event. These are two entities, two national champions that frankly have done a great job in terms of showing what a perfect model in terms of being internationally competitive, but to put capital to work, how to work with multinationals. And I think that is a requirement. You see it in the US with, if you go back, you see an AT&T, you see Google, you see a Yahoo, you see, various, not necessarily national champions, but they de facto national champions in terms of a certain sector. Now, having said that, making sure that they don't crowd out other participants, whether local or national, that's more of a policy play for the regulators or for the officials, rather than asking Aqua or Masdar not to be super competitive. And we see it, in the US, when there are, say, public bids, for example, many times they'll say, well, no single entity can get more than 5% or 10% of the supply. We see it with a company called Con Edison in New York City. They say, okay, we want so much of energy storage, but no single developer can come in with more than 5 megawatts per se at the distribution level out of 15 or 50. So that is an easy fix to create an environment where the local economy is accepting and nurturing and allowing newer entrants to come in. And I think that's a critical requirement for the economy to flourish, and also to You never know who the next Aqua is or the next Master is. So by allowing entrepreneurs to flourish and be supported economically and otherwise is a key policy requirement if the economy were to be truly diversified.
All right, great. Well, thank you both, Shihab and Phil, for your insights today. We covered a pretty wide range of topics, and I think we definitely put a valuable discussion together. So thanks again to the National Council. Thanks for everyone who joined, and of course, thanks for listening, and have a great weekend.
Thanks, Colby.
Thank you for having us.